because we think that we need to advocate for men as caretakers as much as we advocate for women in leadership, for example. Because based on our research, we know that there are intergenerational transmissions of violence, but if we can talk about that, we can also talk about intergenerational transmissions of non-violence and care. And so I think that promoting 50% or that men do 50% of unpaid care work, and it's a matter of economy, it's a way of achieving the gender revolution, or to transform gender relations. And so that's one of the examples of the work that Promundo has been doing. So developing feminist and gender transformative research, and using that research to develop gender transformative methodologies and public policies.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely, that really sounds transformative. So I'm going to turn it to Ilaile from Plan India. You know that your focus has mainly been on young women and specifically girls. And so can you please also tell us about your work and how it is transforming gender in the cities?
Thank you, Dina. Safer Cities for Girls with Plan International essentially speaks about safety and inclusiveness of young children, young boys and girls, young adults, and primarily the group of people who are assumed that they are sort of coming up tomorrow, and then leadership and negotiation skills are still, they need to be further buttressed. And what we've been doing in the program is essentially grooming them, empowering both young girls as well as young boys to work together to make public spaces safer. It is much required to invest in the infrastructure capital to ensure that gendered spaces are accessible to all. However, it is also much required to sort of empower and create that entire social capital with the young people, and so that they intervene in such cases, they are empowered to deal with such cases, and they are able to retract back from saying that I want to be a part of this violence, I don't want to be a part of this violence. So that is essentially what we do through our curriculum modules of Champions of Change. These are essentially action modules that we work through with young girls and boys to take them on this journey. And supplementing this is a lot of, it's not per se defined research, but it's definitely research for them when they do safety audits of their communities to assess how they perceive that safety, how they perceive girls and boys safety, and then they take that auditing process to interface and dialogue with policymakers and lawmakers to essentially arrive at solutions. So the entire cycle of violence in public spaces is broken when you have a set of people who are able to break out from that mold and who are able to say that I don't want to be part of it, and that is primarily what our program does.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ilaile. So I'm going to turn to Caroline. Caroline, we know that you have published a lot in terms of, the focus on gender and cities. And I would like you to share with the audience the work that you have been doing around gender in the cities and how, you have been working around transforming gender power relations.
Thank you very much. A long time ago in the 1980s, with colleagues at the Development Planning Unit, we invented something called gender planning, because we really felt strongly that planners, transport planners, land use planners, all the planners would put women in as an add-on. So that was a long time ago, and since then things have changed a lot, and we've moved to gender mainstreaming. But what happened, I felt, with the UN Habitat 3 coming up and the new urban agenda, was that we had the opportunity to really have a really fundamental paradigm shift as well on the issue of gender. So for me, the first thing was to work out, what do we mean by transformation? And actually, the interesting thing about transformation is it's an incredibly popular term. You might have heard young Kloss use it this morning. Transformation is used everywhere, by everybody, so it becomes a meaningless term. And I think the first thing for me was to work out, well, what do we actually mean by it? And in the sense that it is an inherently political act. And it is closely associated with structural changes in power relations. So that was a really important thing to really work out. And then following on from that, to really start thinking, how do we move beyond gender mainstreaming, which since Beijing 1995 has been the dominant gender policy endorsed by the UN system and implemented across the world by governments, and been very effective as far as it goes. Now, gender mainstreaming has it's twin track. One part is about integrating men and women equally into everything, and the other track is around empowerment. So I sort of thought, well, let's start thinking, what's the difference between gender empowerment and gender transformation? And for me, there's a fundamental and very interesting difference. If we think about gender empowerment, as I say, it's mainly associated with gender mainstreaming, and it describes how individual women, through their agency, increase their bargaining power in public and private spheres to participate fully in economic and political life. And it's really well known. That is what gender empowerment is about. If we look at transformation, as I said, gender transformation, this is inherently a political act, and it's closely associated, as I said, with structural changes in gender power relations. And it emphasizes not individuals, but collective action. And in not only collective action, collective negotiation, collective contestation. And it's not a blueprint, and it's not a quick act, and it's something that takes a very long time to accomplish. And I'll just give you one very, very quick example to show you what I mean. There's a fantastic project in Brazil, in Recife, where you don't just empower women by giving them land rights, but you have a transformative change in power relations by changing the legislative procedures in planning processes. So that's the difference between individual empowerment and structural change. And I think that one of the challenges we have is that this is easier said than done. I think of transport and the way we make safe buses for women, or women-only carriages and things like this in cities across the world. That's protecting women. It's not changing gender power relations at all. It doesn't change the way that men necessarily behave on buses or trains. So it is a really quite fundamental shift. And I started to do this work recently. I'm very excited about it. And I think that there are a number of agencies that are now thinking about how would this really fundamental paradigm shift, what would it entail in terms of their own work?
Yeah, thank you so much for reminding us. You know that actually for us to achieve transformation, we have to look at not just individual empowerment and transformation, but structural transformation that goes beyond individual to the collective. So Taitana, if I come back to you, what do you think about what Karen just said in terms of, the collective transformation? Sorry. It is in relation to what Karen just talked about in terms of transforming, transforming the structures that goes beyond just, transforming individuals. How do you relate with that in your work?
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with Caroline, of course. And although Promundo works at the community level, we usually do that to evaluate our pilot interventions, because in fact, we also do strongly believe that to transform gender norms and gender relations, you need to focus on the structure. So in order to do that, we work directly and we have close relations with the public education sector, with the health sector, with the justice system, with the public security system. So our theory of change includes working that at the community level, but also engaging public sectors and working directly with the government. So making policy recommendations and trying to put these structural issues on the public agenda. So that's the way Promundo works in Brazil and in the other countries where we have offices.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's perfect. You can give that to that side. Yeah, so Nasheen, again, to bring us to the, the practical side of this conversation, because often when we talk about transformation, it sounds something so huge, and we have also been told by Caroline that it's also really long term. But in practical terms, how do you see us achieving this also from the side of the cities?
Yeah.
How can the cities achieve this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I completely agree with both Caroline and with Tatiana, who've touched on incredibly important issues, that this is a long-term engagement. Whenever we start talking about structural dynamics, it's always a long-term engagement. So Pakistan, where shall I start? So we have the legislation in place, on issues of sexual harassment and, rape. And I mean, there's been a series of legislations that have actually been put into place in the last 5 years, but nothing gets implemented, right? Because again, the cultural context becomes one particular dimension of this whole transformative aspect that slows down the process. So how do I see, in practical terms, for me, media is an incredibly important vantage point to engage with. So whilst it's much harder to deal with bureaucrats and policymakers who will turn around and say, oh, this is really sweet, oh, you work on women's issues, right? I mean, generally in Pakistan, that's how it's kind of, oh, you're working on gender? Oh, those are women's issues, right? And what are those issues? Well, generally speaking, a Pakistani bureaucrat, sitting in parliament or in Senate, or even in local government will have a very, very patriarchal attitude, we deal with women's issues, and it'll be somewhere, you go to the women's wing or the women's cell over there, and you can deal with it. So in the last 10 years, the mediascape in Pakistan has transformed in a major, major way, because the whole landscape has been deregulated. So whilst it's still a very fraught landscape, and it's a very conflict-ridden landscape, but it still provides, a very powerful way to kind of engage with these kinds of issues. And in fact, later on, in late August, my partners and I, my two other colleagues who can't be here with me over here today, who've been part of this project, we're actually going to be launching a very big, media campaign, and we are going to be targeting print media. That's going to be our first target, through which we want to make the vast majority of our findings, relatable, to put them out there. So I see the media as a very important terrain through which one can engage with issues of transformation. I'm not suggesting that the outcomes are guaranteed, but I think as an academic, at the end of the day, I can only aspire, and that's about it.
Yeah. So thank you, Nasheen. Coming back to you, in terms of the work that Plan is doing, and again bringing and sticking to the question around the city and how can you make sure that the city is actually doing work that is gender transformative, what is that you have been doing as Plan to work with the city to achieve that?
Transformativeness, I feel, is essentially trying to balance the power imbalance that we've been having since centuries. So when you want to sort of right the balance scale, you have to have multi-stakeholder engagements. You can't work with a certain class of people and leave out the rest. So working with all the different, a lot of the people have been mentioned here, the government, the policymakers, the lawmakers, the media, the young children, the community. What I think adds another flavor, and what we've been doing, is working with the general public. It's likewise in India you do. I mean, of course, I see a little larger penetration in terms of trying to balance and create equality, and part of that, in their public legislation. But there is still that cadre, there is still that notion of, okay, fine, this is a women's right issue, this is a girls' rights issue, so this is an affirmative action that needs to be done. But beyond that affirmative action, if you're looking at transformative behavior, you have to have both sides of the coin coming together. So a lot of our work is also with the general public, trying to convert the bystanders into champions. Because we've also realized that when you're talking about violence and harassment on streets, many a times it is to everyone's advantage, and it is a great motivating factor if I'm out on the street and I know that if I face any harassment, there are people who will help me. Which unfortunately our research right now does not point at. We find bystander apathy to be one of the big cases, at least that we are facing in our programs on safer cities. So that is one critical angle that we need to work with, not only with people in closed spaces, with different policymakers, lawmakers and different groups, but also the general public who hasn't bought into the whole safe city concept yet.
Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you so much, Yelile, for that. So Karen, coming back to you and drawing from your rich experience, I mean, I have read your work, I have admired your work before I met you, and I'm so honored to sit with you on this show. So drawing from your experience, can you, tell the audience what you have seen as, the three most inspiring examples of gender transformation interventions and what you think makes them transformative, gender transformative?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question. But I think, you see, it's very interesting. Today we have quite a number of people from South Africa. And if you look at the post-apartheid housing policy that was implemented and really accessed 50% of houses to women in women's names, you could ask yourself, was that a transformative policy? And in many senses it was. I would argue, and some of you may say it wasn't transformative, so what is a transformative policy? The interesting thing, of course, is that nothing's neutral. And there has, I know, there's been research showing that, of course, there was terrific backlash, actually in terms of violence, because women acquiring homes caused male members of the family to want the home because the titling caused conflicts with partners, whether they were married or civil partners or whatever. So, transformation is not a neutral activity. So the South African example for me is fascinating because it just shows that it can be top down. And I think it's interesting to see and to hear from South Africans who know this better than I do, how far it's been successful. Just very quickly to contrast that, because for me, working as an urbanist, the bottom line is housing. Housing is the first asset everybody wants, in my opinion. And a lot of my work, I relate to an asset framework. Which are the assets? Is it physical capital? Is it social capital? What sort of assets? And housing is the asset in my own research that people want before anything else. So I think another example, which hasn't come up that much, but we did talk a little bit about it in one of the smaller sessions, and I think Jane Weru tomorrow may relate to it, is the global experience of Slum Dwellers, Shack Dwellers International, which doesn't specifically have a gender transformational framework, but works bottom-up, mobilizing around collective accessing land, negotiating with government, negotiating with the private sector, not inquiring land as an entitlement, but through a negotiation process. So I think that one should be clear that there's not a one-way mechanism of reaching transformative outcomes. They are long-term, and I just go back to my original example from Brazil. It's a remarkable story of an organization, a feminist organization, working with local partners. It took them 9 years to contest and to finally get the legislation changed. And the problem that a lot of organizations have, dare I say it, is that we work in a world where donors want quick fixes and quick results. And this isn't what happens under these sort of transformative ways. But I am incredibly optimistic after a long period of feeling rather negative, because I think empowerment is just so focused on the individual woman. And if the individual woman makes it, and the individual woman gets economic activities going, or the individual woman, it's all up to her. And I think it isn't up to her. It's up to much wider structures of power relations. And that's why I think, for me, this is a very, very positive way forward. And I hope that this is something that people can take forward from this type of meeting and think more about. And I want to thank Jennifer, because she came to my session that I did at UN Habitat, and she said, yeah, we need to have a session on gender transformation. So thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think what you talk about in terms of, our tendency, to focus on, short-term quick wins, and individuals as opposed to the systems, I think is also what is causing what we're experiencing as, losing gains. That, we get gains here because they are quick, they are just individual focused, and before we know it, we start losing them because we have not actually prepared the ground well enough to ensure that those gains are sustained and they are passed on from generation to generation. So I'm going to turn to the audience. If you have any questions or contributions, you are going to raise your hand. I hope there's a roving mic in the audience. And you state your name and ask your question or make a comment. So by show of hands, we have one here. Sorry, I'll start from this side. Sorry?
We can use the microphones on the table as well.
And make sure you use the mic. Okay, so I'm going to start from this side. We have one hand here, and I'll give you a number. 1, 2, 3. So we'll start with 3.
My name is Charlotte. I'm from Ghana. My question goes to Tatiana. I hope I'm right. Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation and your work that you are doing on fatherhood, promoting fatherhood, if I'm right. I'm just curious. I'm trying to figure out whether in your work you are facing any challenge in terms of resistance. Because sometimes the resistance is not from the men, but from women themselves. So if you're facing any resistance, how are you trying to address that?
My question is more on the gender transformation concept. I find it fascinating. But I'm wondering how we can achieve that in an environment like the one we have in Africa, where in the urban setting, there is still a gender segregated labor force, where women are still heavily working in the informal sector and receiving very low pay when compared to their male counterparts. And if the idea behind gender transformation goes with economic empowerment to an extent, I'm wondering from your experience how you've managed to marry the two. The fact that there is a high urban group of women who are relying on agriculture in most cases, but more so in the informal sector that is not regulated, that cannot allow them to get that transformative leap, which you have clearly talked about. And then this idea of empowerment, social empowerment and political empowerment that to an extent should also undermine or underpin the transformation. I was just wondering from all of you, where you come from, how you've managed to play these two and how you've managed to get these women in the informal sector to transform themselves and become the leaders that you're talking about.
My comment in line with, or question specifically, in line with gender transformation in the city. I have read almost all of the laws that are governing, that are around gender issues. Why is it that most of these things are just giving premium to specifically women and girls and forgetting about the male folks? Because at the end of the day also, let's don't forget there is also another recent trend. We now have people who are part of the LGBT community. And those people are as well significant in terms of development. What are the focus also towards that in ensuring that indeed we have a transformative system in terms of gender in the cities? Thank you.
So thank you, Charlotte, for your question. It's an interesting question, but Promundo is not, we don't provide services and we don't work on a daily basis with the community. So as I was saying, we we run pilots and we evaluate our methodology, but we are not at the community on a daily basis. But that said, I can give you some examples about resistance from the women's groups that we work with. So we have several kinds of resistances in Brazil, and let me focus in Brazil. So one of the main resistances is from a specific part of the feminist movement in Brazil. So focusing and working on masculinities and doing that as a way of preventing violence sometimes is not considered as part of the feminist agenda. So, but we know, and me, myself as a feminist, of course, I joined the debates, and we know that that results a lot from funding. And so when funding, international funding flows, when they go to the masculinities work, it is withdrawn from the feminist and the women's movement. So it's something that we need to work with. So convince donors to make the two worlds dialogue and connect. When we have specific women's economic empowerment projects and we try to engage men discussing unpaid care work, for example, we see a certain degree of resistance from the women's side. Only when we have projects that focus on women's economic empowerment by engaging men and boys and discussing unpaid care work. But the major resistance that we have right now in Brazil is the government. So we have an illegal government, a really conservative government, and all the gender agenda is suffering backlash. And so, for example, to give you an example, you cannot talk about gender in public schools now because it's considered ideology. And you cannot discuss ideology in schools. So the major resistance to the feminist movement in Brazil, being women's movement or the work that we do with masculinities, violence prevention, is from the government side. So that's something that we need to be creative to overcome. Thank you.
Anyone wants to respond?
Yeah, I just...
Second question.
I just wanted to respond to show you how fragile this is by the example that we've just had from Brazil, because what I didn't mention in my presentation was the extraordinary importance of women in political positions. And Brazil has always been a wonderful example to me of women very strategically deciding to work at the municipal level. And so enormous amounts of women working in municipal government. Would you agree with me? And so you see, it's so fragile, it can so easily change. And that's why I think it's very important, your comment about the role of the state. I mean, we're meant to be having a conversation, aren't we? So it's as important to respond to that. I just want to make one other comment. I think we haven't talked enough about masculinities, and I think that's very, very important, and I apologize again for that. And actually, it reminds me that there's a wonderful project within this one, in Mozambique. And the Mozambique project is really about the disempowerment of men coming back from war and what happens to them. And I think that there is an extraordinary area where we need to look at transformation in post-conflict contexts in different ways, in all sorts of different ways, depending on the context where we're working. That is a fantastic project. I know it's linked with yours. And it's very powerful in terms of trying to understand from a masculinities and masculine identity and what happens to men, and that the transformative nature of what happens to men is as important, and we need to say it. Final comment, just very, very quickly. The whole issue of the informal economy and men and women in it is very tough and very difficult. But again, there are really interesting organizations like WeGo, which is a worldwide network of women working informally that works across the world in different countries, and what it really does is challenge local municipal government around planning legislation, traders legislation, all the types of legislation that can fundamentally affect women as informal sector workers who are often really very disadvantaged in terms of the men that they're competing with in many of these sectors. So I don't have an answer. I fully agree with you that the labour market, the informal sector, etc., is very difficult. But again, we have wonderful examples of organizations that are out there working on these sorts of issues, and it's tapping them and the long-term work that they are doing that I think is helpful for us.
Can I
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but also maybe just to add on, the issue around labor market and women working in the informal sector. I think transformation can actually happen if we start looking at issues of unpaid care work, because it's often that, when women are constantly doing majority of the unpaid care work, that they also find themselves, concentrating in that sector and not really having the opportunity to move on to, to the formal sector. But also within cities and governments, there are policies that actually do support and facilitate women to move from the informal to the formal and to facilitate them. Nasheen?
Yes, thanks very much. I just wanted to, in conversation with the gentleman who pointed out about legislation, I just want to sort of flag that it's also so context-driven. And while I agree with his point that legislation should address, issues concerning not only women but also men and transgenders and generally the LGBT community. I can never say that word properly. So I just want to sort of give the example of Pakistan, right? And so in Pakistan, this question of violence against women is a particularly important one because the political economy question is a very important, challenging issue. So over the last 35 years, 75 years, 70 plus years, we've witnessed 3 intense military regimes. And with each military regimes, we've seen the intensification of the process of Islamization and how certain legal edicts have been sort of manipulated and maneuvered in very strategic ways to legitimize military governments. And specifically in the 80s, under the government of General Zia-ul-Haq, which time period in which Pakistan saw a very intense phase of Islamization, certain Islamic edicts, such as the Hudud ordinances, were taken up, and they were made mainstream, right? And this was a very important piece of Islamic legislation. I mean, it's debatable the extent to which it even is Islamic. And the Hudud ordinances, for instance, have to do with rape. And they have to do with how, if a woman is raped, she needs to produce 3 witnesses to be able to make a legitimate claim that she was raped. So the Hudud ordinances have set back the women's agenda so much in Pakistan, and we are constantly fighting this issue of how do you get the Hudud ordinances revoked. This is the damage done by General Zia-ul-Haq's regime of militarization, which really found its means of power. This was during the first Afghan war, Pakistan fighting America's proxy war and all of that, and this whole issue of Islamization and militarization really kind of coming together, and the sort of the control over women's bodies then becoming a very, very important issue, especially through legislation. So in the last 15 years, there's been quite a bit of debate in Parliament to really revoke the Hudud ordinances. But every time the debate begins, you have certain Islamic parties who may not have enough power through vote bank politics, but in Parliament, they're able to assert their power. So every time certain liberal agendas are put on the forefront to revoke the Hudud ordinances, you have certain powerful Islamic parties who come to the forefront and say, no, you can't, right? And then they launch into all kinds of fatwas that, yes, a man can, hit a woman as long as it's gently and quietly within the household. I mean, there have actually been these kinds of fatwas launched. So, when we start talking about legislation and then when you contextualize it and you begin to see the enormity of the situation vis-a-vis women and violence, especially in a country like Pakistan, then yes, other issues like violence against men, against transgenders, that also needs to be taken into consideration. But this issue becomes an incredibly important one.
I just want to add 2 points essentially. For this entire conversation, I do agree with all of my panelists here. One thing which I feel, the first thing is education. Lack of a proper formal education sometimes prevents women from actually going too much or too ahead into the formal employment sector. So when you have a choice between a formal certified person and a man and maybe a not well certified female, there is always the chance that the man gets the job and continues to be. Secondly, we were talking about unpaid care leave. Women returning from maternity breaks often do not find conducive environments within the employment circle to stay back in their jobs. So many a times you have them going back either to an informal sector or less paying job which has less hours, so that then she continues to take care of the child. I feel that, you know, you definitely need to work with both men and women to sort of solve this issue, but education could be a critical first step in going the long way.
Yeah, and education, the challenge is just definitely the gender stereotypes of what men and women can do and what boys and girls can do, you know. So I'm going to come to this side. I have one. You had your hand up. Have you changed your mind? Has it been answered? Okay, two.
My name is Maysam Zarura. I'm with the IDRC. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists and or talk show guests, sorry. And it's so great to see the research fitting so well into such relevant global debates. And my question is, I have two questions actually, two quick ones. Since we are looking at research and talking about research, can research itself be gender transformative? Especially, for example, at IDRC, we are a research organization and we are very much engaging with these issues and looking at how we can work to change these power structures through research. So can it be transformative? And if not in and of itself, to lead to gender transformation, what else is needed? The second question is maybe a bit more targeted at Caroline. Gender transformation is not a new issue. Why now? Why is it now something, and looking at masculinities in these power structures, what is it that is now happening or needed that so many organizations, donor organizations, et cetera, look, and, you know, government policies, why is it now that we are looking at this, and how can we take it back into policies, and especially since many of these structures are, you know, need gender transformation in and of themselves?
Hello, my name is Eduardo Moncada from Barnard College, Columbia University. Thanks for all the presentations, really engaging stuff. And I had a question a little bit related to a previous question about sort of non-binary conceptualizations of gender, right? And so moving away from sort of thinking about legislation and kind of macro level, I'm just wondering, in the research that you all have done for either for SAIC or in the past, if you've come across any findings or generated findings about non-binary conceptualizations of gender and violence within the city, right? So I'm thinking about violence, sort of like hate crimes and other types of violence that are directed at people who don't fit into this binary of men, women, and how that's played out in some of the locales where you're doing research.
Any other question before I turn back to the panelists? Oh, okay. Please go ahead.
Hi. So I think, you know, if we're to take Caroline's point seriously about really moving to thinking about how gender fits within power relations, but I also think it's really important that we start moving away from just talking about women and men and girls and boys as generic categories, and thinking about how gender overlaps and sex overlap with other kinds of identities, and particularly other forms of inequality. And I think, sadly, because we're not doing that enough, it's actually undermining a lot of the kinds of strategies and approaches that and the kind of support that might actually work for, you know, particularly for women from marginalised communities, for example. But it's a real challenge because, you know, especially with, you know, in a lot of parts of the world where sadly power relationships are deeply predatory and they're violent because they play into the hands of very powerful kind of groups that are quite difficult to challenge. You know, there's a set of contexts in which this is really, you know, needs really kind of nuanced and carefully thought through kind of approaches. So I'm kind of interested a bit in how you think we can do that better. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your questions, Maysam. I'll start by yours. In fact, I'll focus on yours, if that's okay with you, the others. Now, first of all, I want to congratulate the SAIC program and IDRC for having this gender and urban violence panel yesterday and today, all women panel, and that's something that it's really disruptive. My colleague here from Plan, she was saying that she would love to have a man here talking about feminism. We have a lot in Promundo. Unfortunately, I'm here, but I represent the rest of the team. So, and regarding the question about can research itself be gender transformative, I think absolutely. I mean, we're talking about feminist research. And that's its main purpose, I mean, to ask different questions and to reach to different findings that can be disruptive. And so conducting feminist and transformative research can show us, for example, the relational aspects of gender and the intersectionality of gender, for example. It can also show us different scales where violence and non-violence occurs, and enables us to connect those scales. So I would say that we can include, for example, the micro scale and make that a matter of politics. So the personal is political. So for me, and I think for all this panel as feminists and doing research, I absolutely think that it's gender transformative. The major problem for me is what we do with research data. So for example, now we had this program for 3 years. We have really beautiful data and lots of information, and we need to think what to do with that information, because it's frustrating to get all these data and not being able to think about public policies, programming, and other interventions that can be developed based on this, collectively, in fact. So.
These are very difficult questions, and particularly the ones about binary conceptualizations and the fact that gender transformation isn't new and so on. And the only thing I can answer is that I'm actually an urban anthropologist, and I've studied in the same community as an anthropologist, living in that community in Guayaquil, Ecuador. If you look outside, I didn't say I came from England, I said I came from Ecuador, over 40 years. And there I have the capacity and have learnt to look at not all, but to really try and understand complexity. And complexity in terms of the sort of intersectionalities that you're talking about, the sort of issues. The problem is that if you also want to influence policy and you want to work on policy, you have to go from that complexity to you have to simplify it. And of course, they're accused of being technocratic and instrumental. And this is a challenge I faced all my life on my work on gender, that at one level it's highly complex, it's highly contextualized, it's not easy and it's not straightforward. But if you work with policy and policy interventions, you have to come up with recommendations that can be implemented. So, one answer is to say, okay, you've got to have everything at the local level. But if you want to really influence practice and how it changes, you do have to move up and simplify. And that's the tension you face, it's the contradiction you face, and it's the criticism you face. And you have to decide, okay, I think it's worth it. So I do it, but I'm fully aware, and I've had years of being criticized for doing it too, so I'm fully aware that you in order to give a very powerful message across, you do have to simplify. So your comment that gender transformation has been around for a long time, yeah, but I mean, I saw 14, 15 different versions of what it was. So I thought, okay, let's go for it. Let's use Habitat 3. Let's really say paradigm shift. They were using this language, but let's really, really unpack what it means for gender. So, okay, that's a political statement. Whether it's taken on board or not is another matter. So I appreciate these questions about complexity, but also the sort of reality of a global world.
But Caroline, if I can follow up on that, how do you make sure that even as you simplify the complex issues, they don't actually lose their meaning? How do you make that balance? Because I do understand the importance of simplifying for the purpose of, getting the relevant policies, for example, in place and all that. But how do you make sure you don't lose the meaning?
I don't think you can make sure. I think you just have to trust what you're doing and trust that there's a political message behind it and trust that people will take it on. The irony that happened with the gender planning work we did was it was very popular in the 1980s and everybody wanted to be trained. And by the 1990s, the feminists all said this is terribly technocratic and instrumental and we don't want to know anything about it. But the practitioners were still using it, because they needed simple tools and techniques to understand, roles, policy approaches, practical and strategic gender needs. And it continued. So they are different worlds in a way. And these worlds come together and then they coincide at times and then they fall apart at times. And I think the feminist agenda, look at your example of the critique and the struggles with the feminist movement. We move in and out of these worlds, and I think we have to recognize that and take political responsibility for doing that.
Can I just add
just one thing? Sorry, just one thing. I forgot your name. Sorry. About going beyond the binary research. So when we do images, it's the International Men and Gender Equality Survey. We also gather, and we've conducted images in more than 35 countries. We have lots of data, for example, on homophobia, attitudes, etc. So, and being in Brazil, you know that this year 57 transgender women were killed from the beginning of the year until now. So it's one of the countries where you have the highest levels of hate crimes related to trans people. So we have data on the images reports, and they are online if you want to check.
Yeah, I just very, very quickly want to say that often, when we think of is research gender transformative, I'm an academic, and frankly speaking, I consider myself the most powerless human being on this planet. And the only place where I feel I have a sense of power is in the classroom with my students, where I feel I can transgress. And that is a terrain in which I believe that research that deals with gender, that problematizes gender in the ways that we've been talking about for the last 2 days, makes an enormous difference. And in the Pakistani context, I teach at a university in Pakistan, specifically based in Karachi, and I'm teaching a generation of young students who are in their 20s who've never dealt with the gender question, right? These are boys and girls of a certain age who are representative of a certain class, different classes coming from different parts of the city and different parts of Pakistan. So just being able to bring research into the classroom, both in a conceptual and an empirical sense, can be very destabilizing. It's very, very destabilizing. And I think that gender transformative research isn't just about feeding into policy agendas, it's also about feeding into teaching programs. And I think that is very, very important, and we don't even talk about that. And in a country like Pakistan, where the liberal arts tradition has been pretty much, swallowed and subsumed by 3 incredibly powerful military regimes, because it was thought of as anti-military, anti-state, and it was considered, the liberal arts tradition is always considered as propaganda. And we are sitting now in a liberal arts school with a brand new liberal arts program, and we're constantly being watched. Being able to engage with gender issues, is very transgressive, very empowering, and as much as I don't like that word, and very destabilizing. And that is something that I love to do. Thank you.
Okay.
One last question or final thoughts?
Okay, so any final questions? Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I have a kind of different off-the-curve question. So,
introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. My name is Sheila Chugboju. I live and work here. I run a knowledge management consultancy. Anyway, so I lived and worked in Accra for 3 years, and Accra, Ghana, as you know, is a matriarchal society, and Accra is one of those cities that many people love because it's very safe, in the spectrum of African cities, and we used to talk about that a lot, and people used to say, oh, it's because it's matriarchal, and matriarchal cities are so much safer because, it's matriarchal. and that's, well, I don't know if there's any research to support that, so that's my question. And I wondered, because I think it was you, Caroline, who talked about housing, being in housing and how you transfer housing, because in Ghana, men inherit through, you inherit through the female line. And so the power in terms of transferring land comes from the woman largely. So I wondered if that contributed to that. I've never read any research, so that's why it's sort of an off-the-curve question.
I want to relate that to your question about what could be the future work. I haven't got any answers for you. I know a little bit about Ghana, but it's not an area I've worked on. But we had posed to us what could be transformative research. And I think it is precisely these types of really, really fascinating examples, and they will be around the place, there are them. So we start to build up a real picture of what change can be like, but also incorporate some of the other issues around masculinities and other issues that have come in about binary and so on and so forth, all these types of issues. Great question. And I think it gives, that's the food for thought about what the next generation of research can be about on this issue.
Yep. Thank you. Do we have any burning issues, questions before we wrap it up? Okay. I guess yes. We're on time, but I'm going to ask you if you have any closing remarks, point, even one point from any of the speakers. No? Okay. Yeah. Oh, Karen's last point was the closing one. Okay. Okay, great. So thank you so much. I think this has been really definitely enriching for me, and I hope for everyone else in this room. So thank you to the panelists that have really led these discussions, and for all of you for engaging in the conversation. Of course, we know that this is just the beginning and not the end of this conversation. It will continue this afternoon, but also tomorrow and beyond, to ensure that actually, as we have heard, these are complex issues that are not going to be a one-off conference discussion, but are going to be built in all our conversations and dialogues, in our research and in our practices, that they will feed into not just policies, but also our teaching programs and in our action that we do every day. But also, I think gender transformation happens when we have an end in mind in whatever that we are doing. That is not enough that we are building roads, but we actually have in mind who is going to use that road and how that is going to improve the well-being of the person who is using this road and who is using that road in the first place. It cannot be one category of a person. It cannot be just a man or a woman. It has also to think about the intersectionalities of people that live in that specific city. So thank you so much to all of you, to the organizers and the panelists.